Cool. All right, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Babayit, for hosting us, providing refreshments. I want to talk tonight about Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. We're in Elul now, which always feels confusing to me because it's the end of the previous year, but because we start preparing for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, it feels like the first month. I think my whole childhood I thought it was the first month of the year. I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between the idea of judgment that we talk a lot about on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, and how that's connected to questions of life and death and the meaning of life, what it means to be alive. We're going to start with the Gemara about it and look at different pieces from Tefillah as well as from Rav Kook and Rav Shagar. In case anyone here hasn't been in my classes here, Rav Kook was perhaps the head of the modern religious Zionist movement, where it all comes from. The yard site was Gimel Elul. And Rav Shagar was a student of a student. He was a student of Tzvi Yehuda and some of his other students, and was a very interesting thinker in his own right. Died in 2007, and very concerned with questions of existential purpose and meaning, and part of the religious Zionist community and what it means to be part of the modern world and part of the religious world and stuff like that. Very interesting guy. But so we're going to start with the Gemara from Eruvin. It's just a fascinating Gemara. It says, our rabbis taught for 2.5 years Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel were in dispute. The former said, it would have been more pleasant for man not to have been created than to have been created. And the latter said, it would have been more pleasant for man to have been created than not to have been created. Right, so there's a distinction. Beit Shammai are saying it is more pleasant not to be born, not to be created or exist. And Beit Hillel are saying, no, really, being created is great. It's very pleasant. They finally voted and decided that it would have been more pleasant for man not to have been created than to have been created. But now that he's been created, let him investigate his past deeds, or others say let him examine his future actions. And in the original Hebrew and Aramaic, that's like fishfesh b'masav versus mishmesh b'masav, which is a fun sort of just phonetic play. Right, so this is interesting Gemara. Anyone have any thoughts before I start talking about it? What does this make you think of? What do you think they're talking about? What do you think of this Gemara?
Yeah, I know a very interesting pshat of, I think Rabbi Shimon from London, the first of Chabad, said, trying to maybe it would be more convenient for a person not to be born, but after he was born, it's better than he was born.
Right, and so that's part of the question, is the switch between the question of is it better or not to be better to be born versus the conclusion is once man has been created, once we're here, then what?
And another thing...
There's a different perspective.
Yeah. Another thing that Professor Orbach, a very renowned professor in Israel, said that he didn't feel exactly confident with this because we know the person is born for Torah Mitzvot. What do you mean he shouldn't be born? Torah Mitzvot is a very important thing. He said...
Well, so I think that's an important point, which is that it does not say it would be better for a man to have been created or not to be created, which is how it's often sort of quickly translated or explained. In Hebrew it says noach lo. Very, very specifically, it is pleasant lo for that person. It's more pleasant for a person to be created, or is it less pleasant for a person to be created than not to be created? I think it's the Beit Yaakov, one of the Hasidic Rebbe's, who pointed out that it doesn't say tov lo or lo tov lo. That really after the end of the first chapter of Bereshit, you can't say anything bad about being created because God said it's all tov. So it's very specifically a question of noach and lo noach. And this is where I think the question of the meaning of life comes in, because when we talk about meaning, one of the first things we talk about is how comfortable life is. What is the life that we're talking about is our physical existence in the world. Is that itself more pleasant than not being here, or is it less pleasant than just not existing? What would be better to exist or not exist, just on the question of physical comforts?
Another thing which I thought about this, when I studied Midrash, and a couple of interesting angles point of view. One of the he says, so Professor Robert said, you know what, he thinks that the Midrash is disputing only on the shiur Rishayim. On the Dr. Rishayim, there is a dispute with their Kidai, but if not,
Right, so
other people, it's obviously that you're important.
So that, once again, is focusing on the next part of the Gemara, which is that shift from the first question of, is it just fundamentally more or less pleasant to be alive than not alive? And the second question switches and say, well, we're here already, right? Once we're here, then there actually is a different question we need to ask. We conclude that it's not more pleasant to be alive, which makes some basic sense because the question of pleasant or unpleasant only actually exists once you're alive.
It's like, now you just said that, it's kind of, there's almost an absurdity in the way that this is built. Meaning it's like, what would have been more pleasant, to be created or not created? Your conclusion, like practically, is meaningless. Because at the end of the day, you are created. You get, well, it would have been better not be created. Well, okay, you're created.
This has some interesting, contemporary philosophical resonances. There's a philosopher named David Benatar, I think is Jewish, but he doesn't argue based on...
the future?
That's basically the question, is having kids. The philosopher named David Benatar wrote a book called Better Not to Have Been Born, I think. Yeah, and he's officially an antinatalist. He doesn't think we should be having kids because not existing is not as bad as existing. And that comes down to the same question of, can you say it's lo tov versus lo noach? That it's not good to exist versus it's simply not pleasant. One of the fundamental, things that the idea of creation and a God add into ethics that is harder to get elsewhere is that existence is a fundamental good that you can't deny even to yourself. That's why issues of suicide and stuff are much harder to argue against from a non-religious perspective. It's not impossible, but it's harder. Once you assume as a God who created beings and said existence is good, then that is a starting point. Right, so the Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, they vote, which on the one hand is a weird way of deciding philosophical questions, right? It's like either it's true or not, but we're going to vote. But I think it makes sense once you realize it's not talking about is it better or worse in some objective sense to exist. But no, is it literally better or worse from people's perspectives? Do people enjoy living more or not living more?
People's in humanity? Man is in Enoshut?
It is hard to know. Noach lo Adam is the original Hebrew, and Adam could mean an individual, or it could mean humanity. Also because it says Shenivra Yater Mishelo Nivra, it's a question of being created, literally that verb. That could be a reference to literally the creation in the first chapter of the Torah, second chapter, or not.
It's also interesting then that the continuation doesn't follow that well. Investigate this past tense. If we're talking about creation, go back to the very first person or to a baby nowadays. It doesn't have any past tense. You can't examine his future actions. Nothing's happened yet.
Right. So I think it makes sense to say this ends up being a sort of general guidance for any person who finds himself asking this question of would it be better to exist or not to exist? Well, life might be full of suffering and kind of suck sometimes, but you're here. So now that you're here, examine your actions, either past ones or future ones. And I think what that does, though, is it completes the shift away from asking the question about personal pleasantness, right? The first paragraph here is sort of trying to say, is life justified on its own basis? Is life pleasant enough to be worthwhile or not? Then they say, well, it's not, but we're here. The conclusion to what's not, but we're here is, so let's not even ask that question. Let's ask a different question, which is, are your actions worthwhile? There's a shift from life justifying itself to life being for yet something else. And I think that's a really common and important idea when it comes to discussions of what is the meaning of life. There's a book that I have to admit I have not read in its entirety. I've read parts of it, but Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl was a psychologist and a therapist. He was a Jew from Germany who was in the camps, saw lots of his research just burned before his eyes. But he ended up writing this book after the war called Man's Search for Meaning. And he came up with this whole approach to therapy called logotherapy, about the importance of meaning for being a human. And part of it is about the meaning is always like you're working on something. There's something outside of yourself that you've dedicated yourself towards. And that's really what the conclusion of the Gemara is here. It's, okay, now that you're here, that you have some sort of raw existence, what is it for? And are you living up to that standard? That you have to be examining your actions to see if they're matching up to that whatever sense of what you're for. And this is exactly, we're going to talk about in the next couple of pieces, what Yom Kippur davening, Rosh Hashanah davening really sort of want us to talk about, what tshuva in general is sort of about, is raising this question of like, what am I for, and am I living up to that? Okay. If no one has any questions, we'll move on to the first section on birth, because there's this fascinating line from the Yom Kippur davening that I've always really liked. Source number 2. This is, my God, until I was created, I was not worthy. Now that I was created, it's as if I was not created. Dust am I in my life, all the more so in my death. I am before you a vessel filled with embarrassment and shame. So it's a sort of intense line.
No kidding.
But I liked it because this piece from Rav Kook that we're going to look at next, he's going to sort of put it not exactly in the same terms as we just looked at in the Gemara, but I think it's the same basic sort of idea. Because before I was created, the whole infinite time from eternity until I was created, there was certainly nothing in the world that needed me. And this is from Rav Kook's commentary on the Siddur, or Latzariya. Had I been lacking for some purpose or completion, I would have been created. Thus, the fact that I was not created is a sign that I was not worthy to be created then, and there was no need for me except at the time when I was created. Because except for the time when I was created, because the time had arrived when I needed to fulfill some purpose for the completion of reality. If I dedicate my actions to the purpose of my creation, then I am now worthy. But since my actions are not intended for the good of this purpose, then I have not achieved the purpose of my creation, and I am still unworthy as before. Is to break that down, because Rav Kook likes his really long run-on sentences. He says that before I was created, all of the time before I was created, there was clearly no reason for me. I was not worthy of existing because there was nothing to define my being worthy of existing. And then eventually it came to the time when I was worthy of existing. There was a sudden lack in reality that I was going to fill. And then I was created. And that's the idea basically we're talking about, life being for something. Right? That if the question of life itself, and is it fundamentally good, is not enough to justify its own existence. Life always has to be for some sort of other purpose. Rav Kook is saying that is really how we have to view birth. Birth is not a self-contained moment of life. Birth is the beginning of life for something. That there was, in fact, a for something that preceded the life. There was a lack in reality that needed this person to be born that actually precedes the person's birth. And I always think of that sort of structure in terms of the difference between the first 2 chapters of Bereshit, the creation of man, which is in that the first chapter of Bereshit, man is just created. There's no real sort of statement about why man is going to be created. There's a little bit of lead up with let's make man in our image, but there's no statement about man being necessary, versus in the second chapter of Bereshit, where there's talk about the garden first. And it says, Hadam ayin la'avodat ha'adamah, there was no person to work the land. There's a visible human-shaped hole in reality that needs to be filled. That's why man is created. And so Rav Kook's saying that's basically how everyone should view their own life. I was born the moment there was a me-shaped hole in reality. There was a space that I was meant to fill. And that leads to the next moment, which is I'm here now. Am I doing what I'm supposed to be doing? Rav Kook says, if I dedicate my actions to the purpose of my creation, then I am now worthy. But since my actions are not intended for the good of this purpose, then I have not achieved the purpose of my creation. I'm still unworthy as before. That's the very intense end of that paragraph from Tefillah. Dust am I in my life, all the more so in my death. I am before you as a vessel filled with embarrassment and shame. This is so as I am in my life, all the more so in my death. Because once you've raised the question of like, is life for something, and are we living up to that? That's where you get into, uncomfortable questions about like what would be worth ending life, not living up to that. I'm not gonna.
But surely once you're dead, you've fulfilled your tafkid, and there's no longer need for you because you filled it. So
Right.
It shouldn't be embarrassing that you're dead.
Right. No. So I don't think he's saying embarrassment in death. He's saying those are sort of two different clauses. Dust am I in my life, all the more so in my death. Which I think is just saying that right now it's as if I was dead. Like, it's as if I had reached the end of my purpose because I'm not fulfilling anything right now.
Saying though that you're never fulfilling it, since my actions are not.
Right, so I think.
And then every year you say.
So at that point.
So you never achieve.
Right, so at that point, I think it's a shift from the theoretical discussion of like the idea behind this line to feel to saying, what am I supposed to be thinking when I say this line? And then I think it's a question of like, is it a secondary question of meaning this in tefillah, and is it accurate or not? I think Rav Kook is going to assume that it's accurate, that when we say this on Yom Kippur, we should really feel like I have not lived up to everything, possibly because, as Neely suggested, there's a connection between having fulfilled your purpose and sort of being dead. But I think that it's probably a individual question of, like, when I say this line, do I really believe I haven't fulfilled my purpose? That I've not lived up to it? I think probably most of us, it's a mix. We rarely have one specific purpose. We probably have a lot of things that we're supposed to be doing in individual sphere, familial sphere, religious sphere, social sphere, and then some of them we do better than others, some of them we don't do at all, some of them we plausibly do perfect. I'm a little skeptical of people that do stuff perfectly. On the whole, very skeptical of people being good at anything at all. We all work really hard and fail most of the time, but we never fail entirely, so it works out okay.
Very optimistic.
I never claim to be an optimist.
If you're you're made for a purpose and you want to believe that one day you're going to achieve it. Otherwise,
You have the hope. You have the hope.
Right, so I think, and possibly, Rav Kook has a really interesting piece in Ortho Kodesh. She talks about the idea of perfection, that we tend to think of perfection as something fixed and like done, but we also think there's something beautiful and perfect about growth. That there's actually two different types of perfection, and that somehow one of the purposes of creation and existence is to express that kind of perfection. Because when we normally talk about God doesn't get better or improve. God is just sort of statically perfect. So the idea of improvement as a form of perfection is something that only exists once you have lack and failure and all the people being bad at stuff. So the idea that we are actually supposed to be constantly striving towards that goal, but not necessarily ever quite making it, actually make a lot of sense. But I think it also would connect to the idea that life is for something. Once again, if you could finish it, then you'd be done. But if you're always working towards it, then your life is always for that having ever quite reached it. Any other questions?
I'm not a big historian, but I remember reading at one point this like cryptic passage from David Ben Gurion about the purpose of messianic aspirations to the Chilonit Zioni community, and he talked about the fact that the great thing about Mashiach is that he hasn't come yet, and that as long as Mashiach hasn't come, so we'll be working for something. There's some like final goal that we're all always pushed towards, and he's like, between the lines. I mean, it obviously wasn't religious. But between the lines was like, Mashiach should never come, so we always have something to be working towards in our life. Continue to use that purpose. It's kind of like it's not really like it, but
It's fast.
The Memra and the Gemara is where one of the rabbis are like, we don't want to be there for Yemot HaMashiach, even though that's more like Chevle Mashiach, but it's always like interest, like that sentiment.
There's all kinds of interesting stuff also on the secularization of the idea of Mashiach in the modern era. That like the idea of the modern state was that we could all take care of ourselves and create our own sort of messianic era, and then like Jews in specific have all kinds of interesting statements about it. So Kafka has this fascinating line about like the Messiah will come when he's no longer needed. He'll come not on the last day, but on the very last, somehow, like really just after everything, including after the messianic era. Yeah. All right, so the next section is going to be about tshuva and death, which is, as if birth is talking about sort of the beginning of life and the shift from not life to life. This is the end of it. What we're mostly going to look at here is some pieces from the Rambam and then Rav Shigar's explanation of them, because it turns out that Rambam, when he talks about tshuva, talks about death a lot. Rav Shigar has an essay on this, and it was really surprising to be like, wow, Rambam just talks about death a lot in context of tshuva. So I have here some selections from Hilchot Tshuva and run through them a little bit and explain them. From the 7th chapter, and the Rambam talks in the middle of Hilchot Tshuva about Bechira, free choice. It's like a critical aspect of tshuva. He says, since free choice is granted to all men, as explained, a person should always strive to do tshuva and to confess verbally for his sins, striving to cleanse his hands from sin in order that he may die as a Baal tshuva and merit the life of the world to come. Therefore, and Rambam says explicitly elsewhere, the purpose of tshuva is Kadesh Yamut v'yeh Baal Tshuva, that you should die as a Baal Tshuva. That the moment that tshuva is sort of realized, that you've really accomplished tshuva, is not the moment you've sort of changed as a person. It's the moment that has stuck until you've died. The sort of who you are is determined in the moment you die. The meaning of your life, whatever you've sort of achieved, ends there. So very much the meaning of your life is sealed for sort of the rest of eternity in the moment you die. For Rambam, you really want that moment to be on a good note. That's what tshuva is about, isn't being still on work, doing the things you're supposed to be doing when you die. A person should always view himself as leaning towards death, with the possibility that he might die at any time. Thus, he may be found a sinner. Because if you don't do tshuva, and you could just die at any time, then at any point in time that could be where your story ends. In a sense, it's very much about the way stories end really determines the meaning of the whole story. And if your story could end at any time, you want it to have a good ending. Even if he transgressed throughout his entire life, or repented on the day of his death and died in repentance, all his sins are forgiven. This is the flip side of that idea again, that if you've done tshuva at the end of your life, that essentially undoes everything that happened beforehand. For Rambam, the importance of tshuva and sin is actually not about like, oh, you have this tainted past. It's how does it affect you as a person? So you as a person have good deeds, bad deeds, they all affect who you are. They're part of your personality. And tshuva is really trying to become a new person. Here's this great line that I don't think I brought here, where he talks about, you should maybe change your name. You don't have to change your name to do tshuva, but if you really want to be a different person, it's not a bad move. Help you see yourself as someone different. If a person's sins exceed his merits, he will immediately die because of his wickedness. That doesn't, strictly speaking, have to do with tshuva, but Rambam puts it in there as part of his general discussion. It's one more mention of death in his whole Hilchot Tshuva. Just as a person's merits and sins are weighed at the time of his death, so too the sins of every inhabitant of the world together with his merits are weighed on the festival of Rosh Hashanah. If one is found righteous, his verdict is sealed for life. If one is found wicked, his verdict is sealed for death. A Benoni's verdict remains tentative until Yom Kippur. If he repents, his verdict is sealed for life. If not, his verdict is sealed for death. And just to read the last one quickly, when does the statement that these individuals do not have a portion in the world to come apply? When they die without having repented. However, if such a person repents from his wicked deeds, it dies as a Baal Tshuva, he will merit the world to come, for nothing can stand in the way of tshuva. So that last one is the same basic idea we saw before. I want to focus on the paragraph I read quickly. Just as a person's merits and sins are weighed at the time of his death, so too the sins of every inhabitant of the world together with his merits are weighed on the festival of Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah, according to this, is fundamentally a rehearsal of the moment you die. The moment you die is a moment of judgment, because that's it. You can't fix things anymore. You can't change. That's your story is closed. It's going to print as is. then Rosh Hashanah is the day that happens for everyone. And I think that raises a question that we'll see sort of in the Rosh Hashanah pieces here that always bothered me, which is, why is there one day of judgment? Or if you're going to talk about the Rosh Hashanahs for other things, why is there one day of judgment for people and one for animals and one for... But whatever. Why is there one day of judgment? Like, God can judge us all the time. We're all really good at judging ourselves all the time, so I'm pretty sure God could do it too. Why does there need to be one? What?
It's 2 days.
2 days of Rosh Hashanah. Yom Arichta. It's one long day, according to the Gemara. No, this is the say, it's judgment on Rosh Hashanah, capacity for repentance until Yom Kippur. It's clearly not just one day, but regardless, why is there a season of judgment, as it were?
It sounds like there really is every day, because it says if your sins exceed your merits, then you'll immediately die. So it is like
Right.
you are being weighed every day, but
Yeah, no, it's a good question. That's a very fascinating point. I think we're going to see that. 1 second. In case it's not actually in the pieces I brought from Rosh Hashanah, Rosh Hashanah suggests that the Rambam wants us to really view Rosh Hashanah as a rehearsal. That the same way we have this sort of build-up to Rosh Hashanah, we should have this build-up to the day we die, except we don't know when the day we die is. So we should always live like we could die the next day in terms of repentance and sort of tshuva.
It does bring a great tense, because everything...
Yeah. Unless anyone has anything else to interject, I want to look at a couple pieces from a sefer from Rosh Hashanah called Shuvi Nafshi, which is a collection of essays on tshuva, which is a couple on the Rambam, one on Rav Soloveitchik, one on other Rishonim, some on Chassidut. It's a really wonderful little book. And these are from his essay on the tshuva and death in the teachings of the Rambam. He says, the day a person dies is not a predetermined date set for a person's judgment day. It's simply an imminent result of their situation. The judgment is nothing other than the person's state at the moment he dies, and this is his eternal fate. This fact heightens the tension surrounding repentance and judgment, a tension that expresses the combination of the incidental, man's fleeting existence, and the fact that this incidental thing has an absolute, total, and infinite character. The anxiety of judgment, its fateful, decisive character, comes from exactly this combination. The fleeting receives eternal force. The fact that a person dies at a specific moment, something typically entirely incidental, and that this is what determines a person's eternity, causes the fleetingness itself to gain urgency and faithfulness of eternity. So in contrast to, as you pointed out, Lital, that that line from Rambam from the third parak says that we will die, the person dies immediately in his wickedness. In contrast to that, Rambam, generally speaking, talks about death as a totally natural phenomenon. He goes on, he talks about it in the Mor Nevuchim like that. He, I think, talks about it elsewhere in Hilchot Tshuva. Certainly in Hilchot Tshuva, he says that. I think I'm misremembering, but certainly in the Mor Nevuchim, he talks about death as a totally natural thing. It's not weird that people die. People don't die as a punishment. It's just part of human nature. And that could happen any time. So what Rosh Hashanah is saying is that the Rambam is trying to really increase the tension here by combining something of seemingly out of control with something of incredible importance. That death would seem to be something very arbitrary. That it's just, it happens whatever. It's not a function of your deeds. It's not a function of a greater plan. It's just the nature of things. And that becomes much scarier when the nature of things suddenly is tied to an issue as great as the meaning of your life, your moral and religious nature and state, and in terms of Rosh Hashanah, like judgment and punishment and those sort of ideas that get tied to something so arbitrary. The idea that at any moment, your fate could be decided, not just in terms of whether you continue to live or not, but in terms of whether you have had the time to succeed in whatever your life is for. That if the meaning of your life is based on what it is for and whether or not you're living up to that, it's kind of crazy that there's something out of your control and uncontrollable that could interfere with that. So the next piece from Rosh Hashanah, he's going to talk about this Rosh Hashanah point that I mentioned before. It seems that a single day of judgment, Rosh Hashanah, was established in order to emphasize in actual practice the acuteness and intensity of existence, the ethical consciousness according to which we should live every day of the year. That's why Rambam constructs Rosh Hashanah on the model of the day of death. Rosh Hashanah is the judgment and the life in the shadow of death that is eternity. It's a really sort of intense line he puts there. Rosh Hashanah is the judgment and life in the shadow of death that is eternity. And this is what we've basically been talking about. So I want to stop on this for a second. The question of what is life for? Life being for something, that's the eternity Rambam's talking about. Is a life lived in attempt to fulfill and in fulfillment of whatever life is for, is the moment where life really achieves transcendence, where you've gone beyond just the bare life and like existing and trying to exist comfortably and have some sort of like just success in physical existence. The moment you've reached beyond that, he's saying you've reached some form of eternity. You've reached outside the bare material of human existence and sort of achieved something else. Rosh Hashanah is the judgment and life in the shadow of death that is eternity. That this sense of judgment of like, oh, I'm for something and need to be asking the question of, am I living up to that? And life lived in the shadow of death with a sense of like, it's critical that I be living up to who I'm supposed to be. That's what it means to partake in something that transcends human reality and to partake in eternity. Yeah?
Like, as opposed to distinguish between Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, it's like Yom Adin should be sad and crying. No. Most of them forbid to cry. It's a shadow of death. Most of the poskim in Rosh Hashanah is not a... Well, it's not exactly like Sukkot, it's not a Bechagecha, but it's definitely not a sad day. You should cry this day. Yom Kippur is something else.
Right.
The shadow of death, and it should be very, very...
Right, so I think it's hard not to talk about death in an intense way, but the flip side of this is the incredible meaning that does come with thinking about, my life is actually significant. There's a point at which the things I have done have a concrete, unchangeable meaning. That, in a sense, death gives life meaning. It's a very sort of thing that comes about in 20th century existentialism. Death gives life meaning by virtue of finitude, by virtue of it being the end. Because if we just went on forever, then nothing would mean anything. Because anytime we reached and achieved some sort of purpose, we find a new one, and we just move from thing to thing forever. And we would just change one way or the other. It wouldn't matter had we done the right thing or not the right thing, because we could always change it later. The sense of finality actually gives importance to specific actions. So this action I'm doing now matters because I don't know what's going to happen afterwards. So Rav Shigar has a really interesting drasha on there's a story from the Gemara about Rabbi Elazar ben Dordaya, who talks about the first half of the story. He's a egregious sinner, spending all kinds of money, doing all kinds of things, terrible, sinning person, and has one moment where he realizes what he's been doing. And that part of that is yesh kona olamo b'sha'ah achat, that in a moment you can gain the next world. And part of the way Rav Shigar explains that is he realizes at some point I get held responsible. I can't always do tshuva in the future. I can't say, time will come when I'll do the right thing. For now, I'll do whatever I want right now. I'll do something better later. Rambam in his Hilchot Tshuva, when he says that, he talks about the idea from Chazal that being a Baal Tshuva, to have sinned and done and repented for it, to have done tshuva, is somehow better than never to have sinned. He says, okay, but don't take that as like practical advice. Don't say, I'll sin and then do tshuva, because maybe you'll never actually do tshuva. And the reason he can say maybe you'll never actually do tshuva is because at some point you die. At some point you won't be able to do tshuva anymore. If we die, then our actions never have any sort of concrete meaning because we could always undo them. It's the passage of time and the very sort of inevitability of it that gives our actions meaning in the world. So to continue in the source number 6, Rambam puts in effort to solve the problem of why a specific day of judgment was established, because a person's judgment is a function of his inner condition, something that is true each and every day. According to Rambam, the selection of Rosh Hashanah's day of judgment to a large degree arbitrary and incidental. He compares this happenstance to the happenstance of the day a person dies, and thus sets up the fatefulness of the judgment on Rosh Hashanah. Just as the day a person dies is incidental, so too is Rosh Hashanah. That's when a person's fate in this world is decided. There's something specifically both incidental and arbitrary about this judgment, but that's its nature. The concept of judgment as absolute happenstance is the basis of this day. He says that you're right. If tshuva is sort of about who we are, then we have to be judged all the time. It's just, like I said, judgment is about who we are, but whether or not we're living up to the purpose of what our life is for. In some sense that our life is for something. That judgment happens all the time, because we can always look at our life and say, am I living up to it or not? And it's sort of weird at that point to have one day. And the reason for that is it recreates the one day where you die. The one day that sort of shows up. And that's why Rosh Hashanah is just like an arbitrary day, right? By virtue of having one day, then it's sort of something that happens to you. In a sense, it makes it weird that we spend the month of Elul beforehand trying to do tshuva, because that makes the day less arbitrary. This is the day that actually comes when we're at our best. We spent a month becoming the best people we're going to be all year round. But Rambam's and Rosh Hashanah's argument is right. We should always be in Elul. We should always feel like we're just leading up to the moment of judgment, because every moment is a moment of judgment. We are at any given point in time either living up to whatever our life is for, or we're not.
Kind of, I don't know if Rav Shagar is mityaches to this in the essay, but there are all sorts of Gemarot and Midrashim about oh, well, this is the day that Yosef yatsa mi Beit HaAsurin, and this is the day that Hashem pakal et Chana v'et Sarah, ve'ayom harat olam, we say after the... all this stuff. And then it's just and here he's just coming and saying, that's all nice, but meaning, it gives those Midrashim not, obviously, not historical meaning, but more just value meaning-ish, meaning
No. That's it's a very good question. I think often a lot of times you mentioned Hayom Harat Olam. Today is the birth of the world. We've already seen how talking about birth can be talking about the question of I was born for something. Have I successfully lived up to that? And as we're going to talk about in the next part of this year, we can ask these questions much larger than the individual scale. So Hayom Harat Olam. Today the world was born, and is it living up to what it is for? But no, I think you're right. I think there's a lot of different elements that go into Rosh Hashanah, and that I don't think it has to be only one thing, only this very heavy death-focused thing. I think the best example of this is from Sefer Nehemiah. Sefer Nehemiah is the one depiction of Rosh Hashanah in Tanakh. And it's just there's a reading from the Torah, and everyone gets super sad, and people are crying. Someone's like, "What are you doing? Send gifts, have great meals, just have a great time. Be a very happy day."
Another thing that I talked about, he says a bit Asurim and Agnes Yitzchak. They say the Yitzchak was again reborn. This is also the wedding. You still got out of the prison. He's reborn. It's freedom. That's fit Rosh Hashanah.
Right. So I think there's a lot of things going on in Rosh Hashanah. And I think that one way of viewing rebirth is a question of rededication and freedom in terms of freedom to do what you want, what you think you're supposed to be doing. But
so you're born into responsibility. You have a responsibility because you're born today and have another chance.
Right.
It doesn't mean blue. It means more responsibility.
Right.
More responsible. You have a chance every year to be more responsible.
Right.
It's not an easy task.
Yes. And I think you can be happy about the opportunities you have, and happy about things you're responsible for, and all kinds of different. I think there's a lot of different elements that go into Rosh Hashanah, and this is sort of one of them. Any questions before we move forward? Great. The last section here that I want to look at is starting with a piece of tefillah that we say from Rosh Hashanah through Yom Kippur. and then an explanation, a somewhat related piece from Rosh Hashanah. This piece from Tefillah we add into the Bracha of Kedusha, Atah Kadosh, and I'm thinking maybe we don't add it in during 10 days. Whatever, we add it in Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, certainly. Then we add this whole section into the Bracha of Kedusha about essentially the messianic future, about what we want the world to look like, and it doesn't look like now. We say, and this is the translation from, or say everything in this was translated by me in the whole source sheet, except for this bracha, which I got from Sefaria, and the Rambam, which is from Chabad.org. So, source number 7, you are holy and your name is holy, and holy beings praise you every day forever. And so grant that your Adonai, our God, be upon all your works. Tein pachtecha kol ma'asecha, and your dread upon all that you have created, and all your works will fear you and prostrate before you, and you will be all your created. And prostrate before you will be all your created beings. And may they all form a single band to do your will with a perfect heart. For we know, Adonai, that our God, that rulership is yours, strength is in your hand, might is in your hand, and your name is awesome all over you. Over all you have created. And so, grant honor, Adonai, to your people, praise to those who fear you, good hope to those who seek you, confident speech to those who yearn for you, joy to your land, gladness to your city, flourishing of pride to David, your servant, and an array of light to the son of Yishai, your anointed speedily in our days. And then the righteous will see this and rejoice, and the upright will be jubilant, and the pious will exult with joyous song. Injustice will close its mouth, on all the wickedness will vanish like smoke when you remove the evil from the earth. And you, God, will reign alone over all your works on Har Zion, dwelling place of your glory, and in Yerushalayim, city of your sanctuary. As it is written in your holy words, Adonai will reign forever, your God Zion, throughout all generations, praise God. Holy are you, and awesome is your name, there is no God beside you, as is written, and Adonai Tzvaot is exalted through justice, and the Almighty, the Holy One, is sanctified through righteousness. Blessed are you, Adonai, the King, the Holy One. Melech HaKadosh. And this passage is beautiful. It's like a lot of fun to read from a literary perspective, at least for me. I like the way it sort of builds, but it always felt very random. Right? What are we doing with this suddenly in the middle of Tefillah? What does this have to do with Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? Anyone have any thoughts?
Like the part of anointing God to be a king, has to do with the mouth.
Right. So I think
It always sounds like
that's
God doesn't need that.
right. That's a much bigger question. I think the biggest question about Rosh Hashanah is that we talk about crowning God King. What does that mean? But on a simple level, you're absolutely right. It's like that's the basic connection between this text and Rosh Hashanah is that Rosh Hashanah we talk about crowning God King and God's kingship, and that's what's happening here. God being king in a very practical sense. Everyone's sort of experiencing that kingship. But that's very different from all the other ways we talk about God being king, which is like lots of quotes from Sukkim from Tanakh that are saying God is king and stuff. And why are we concerned here with God being king in the future? Right? All of this is on that day. It will happen in the future that this is how it will be.
You know, the order is very interesting. First it said, with all God's creation. And then people, then it's a big
Right, there's an intensification throughout the passage. So if anyone has any other thoughts to help sort of build, yeah?
I mean, it's like, I don't know, it's like very simplistic, but it's just like, it's an end point. Meaning at some point, it's almost like the statement of, we want it to go somewhere, and then on that day, this is where it ends. Like this is what we're looking for. This is the end of the chapter. This is the end, or something like that. I don't know.
Right, that's a very interesting idea.
Like direction or something.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Right, I think that I want to say something at the very least close to what you're saying. I want to look at a piece here from a drasha from Rav Shagar. I think it's a drasha for Yom HaAtzmaut, possibly Yom Yerushalayim. But here she talks about midrashim about the Mashiach. He says that there's basically two approaches to Mashiach writ large in the Jewish tradition. One is very minimal. Ein bein olam hazeh l'olam haba ela shibud malchut ein bein olam hazeh l'yemot Mashiach ela shibud malchut bilvad. There's no difference between this world and the next world, except for like Jewish sovereignty. and whether we're under control of the nations. And he associates that with a certain reading of Rambam, where Rambam says that like Mashiach's a guy, right? Mashiach's a guy who comes and fights the wars, he leads some sort of tshuva movement, he's king, protects Jewish people, that's Mashiach. And on the other hand, you have these like fantastic midrashim that, I don't know about you guys, it's certainly what I grew up on, of like fruit the size of a house, and like just you can take whatever you need off a tree, and like everything is magical, and like everything is mystical, and literally flying on the wings of eagles, and like there are all these fantastic midrashim about the days of Mashiach and what it will look like. So Shigar wants to try and explain, like, why are they talking like that? Like, what is the value? Not even asking, like, do they mean it literally? Do they not mean it literally? It's like, what does it mean to say, to really believe that things will be so radically different in Yom Mashiach? They will look nothing like the world we live in now. And as you read it, I want to be asking the same question about this passage from Tefillah. What does it mean to say, on that day, God will be king, and everyone will experience God being king? And so he says, in order to understand these wondrous magical depictions, which are not of this world, we can look to a somewhat parallel literary phenomenon, science fiction. Both science fiction and the rabbis' homilies, midrashim, speak about the future redemption and describe an alternate world. This world's primary purpose, if we can speak of alternate world's primary purpose, if we can speak of such a thing, is to lay bare the mystery of our lives, aiding the collapse and destruction of our banal, boring, everyday life. In the rabbis' days, there were no rockets. The eschatological homilies don't talk about distant galaxies or about worlds full of robots and beyond human creatures. However, they contain just as much magic and wonders as great science fiction contains. They provide the realistic possibility of a substantive alternative to this world, an alternative that many of the rabbis certainly thought would one day arrive. In this way, the miraculous and wondrous bursts into the world and disrupts its factual scientific stability. Rosh Hashanah is actually working here off of like critical science fiction theory. I wrote a paper on this a couple of years ago, and I did a lot of really interesting reading on like what happens to people when they read science fiction. How do science fiction readers experience what they're reading, and then their lives outside of it. That part of the purpose of science fiction is to challenge the way things are right now by imagining something different. And not just by imagining something different, but by drawing a line between where we are now and where we're going to be, and putting that radically different possibility on the line. That somehow we're going to go from where we are today to that future. And a classic sort of well-known example is Star Trek is a theoretically future story about perfect peace in the galaxy. The Federation is just like, all the people, not the galaxy, but all the people, the human beings, just peace on Earth, great, everyone's getting along. And it's meant to like challenge that we could just be better now. We have to somehow try and move from the way we are to the way we will be, which it imagines to be this, like, whatever possibility. And Shigar mentioned other possibilities here, beyond human creatures, robots, other things. But it's trying to break us out of how like stuck in and used to we get with the world we live in. That we live our lives in a very sort of everyday, blasé way. And we're just used to the way things go. And success is, generally speaking, not defined by like stopping, taking a minute to like ask, what am I doing? Should I be doing whatever? It's like, did I do well? Did I do well what I was doing today? Right? I had my to-do list. I accomplished it. Most days we don't stop to ask, should I be doing the things I'm doing? Should I be reevaluating everything? And you can't live your whole life reevaluating. You have to go on and live it at some point. But it's critical every now and then to stop and reevaluate. And one of the things that science fiction tries to do is tries to get us to do that on a very broad level. What about our lives do we sort of assume will always be the way it is? But we could really change it. We could really stop and question it. And Rambam says that that's what these midrashim are doing with Mashiach. And I want to say that's what we're doing with this set of like lines about the redemption, the Messianic era, that like things will be different then. Is that it's really about the effect, the imagining that has on us now. Because this text is saying there will be a day will come when things will look radically different from how they look now. That the way that things look now is we don't experience God being king. That, all of the statements about people fearing everyone joining together, all together, to serve God, and there being peace on earth, and the removal of rule of evil from the earth. Those are things that we don't see in our everyday lives, and on the whole, we don't assume they're like realistic possibilities in the here and now. And maybe they're not, because that doesn't something that happens in one step. And the first step to going from here to there is imagining that it really will be that way. And then wondering, well, what would have to change now to get there? Just a couple of thoughts come to mind about that. One, Rosh Hashanah, when he talks about this line about like peace on earth and removal of evil in different drashah, he says this is like what people talk about when they use the phrase "a new Middle East" around Oslo. Is the idea of like suddenly everything will be better. There was a time when people looked at the Middle East and said, maybe we could solve like one or two little fights that are going on, and then there would just be a peace all around the world. And that part of what's happened sort of since in the last 20 years, for good reasons and bad, is most people have gotten pretty set and this is the way things are. When things try and change, they often get worse. They certainly don't get better. This is the way things are, and the ability to imagine things differently is really critical. And then, just I think it occurs to me that this is also essentially the intuition behind Rambam's understanding of shofar in Hilchot Tshuva. He says there's no explicit meaning for the mitzvah, but there is a remez, an allusion from the pasuk, which says Uru Yishenim. The function of the shofar is to wake you up, that we sort of are asleep most of the time. We go on autopilot. We just function the way things have always been functioning, and we are generally we work hard at succeeding at the way things have been going. We never stop to wake up and step out of the way things have been going to ask, what do we really want to be doing? Are we doing that? And if we're not doing that, what do we have to change to start heading in that direction? And I think that's sort of what this text is doing from Tefillah. Thoughts, questions?
I just think it's interesting. I just think it's interesting that, from my understanding, at least from reading this passage, it almost sounds like Rav Shigar is saying kind of a different take totally from the idea. Like for example, in the part about death, it kind of felt like, okay, there's not really let's say intrinsic value of tshuva, but it's extrinsic, and then you don't want to end up at the end of the day with a bad hand, as to say. And here also. In the prayer, I guess my thought of it was okay, so at the end of the day, the righteous people are going to be like this, the wicked people are going to be like this, and you probably want to end up like one of the righteous people. But I feel like he's bringing a much more intrinsic value of.
One I should note that the text about science fiction does not originally have anything to do with Rosh Hashanah, Kippur, Tshuva, any of that stuff. I made that connection. I think that in both cases, the talking about death and tshuva, and then talking about this sort of messianic vision in tshuva, in both cases are about imagining an end to the way things are right now. That what Rambam is trying to get us to do with, thinking about death and tshuva, is to imagine that the way things are right now, our life could end. So how do we want to make them? And this is about sort of saying that the way things are will end, and then they'll be better. And we should really imagine that switch, that ending. How do we want to go about that? I also want to note that, like I'm saying, I was sort of mentioning earlier, that this is really on a societal level. There's obviously an individual element. I'm personally saying this in Tefillah. I see myself as an individual, as part of society, but we live in communities, smaller communities like Bayit, bigger communities like Yerushalayim, State of Israel, the world, and we tend to sort of assume that things will generally look the way they've always looked, unless you happen to live and be globally conscious at a moment of upheaval, like the creation of the State of Israel, the fall of the Soviet Russia and the Iron Curtain. Unless you live at one of those moments, we tend to assume things will keep going the way they are. And one thing that really having this sort of messianic sense is the ability to imagine that society on a whole will change. That the way we interact with other people, one-to-one, but also as groups and much larger groups, will be just very different. And that's an important part of tshuva, is asking, like, how do I start making those changes now? What are the things I can do to be moving towards that? Sort of imagining that I could, try to imagine what am I for, in the sense of what is the best way I should be living my life, how to interact with other people, and sort of trying to move in that direction. I think that's basically all I have to say. I just think it's really interesting to on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, take a moment to appreciate the questions of life and, what is it for, and is it just for itself? And if not, how can I, trying to figure out what my life is for? I want to note that I haven't at any point tried to suggest what life is for on an individual or broader level. I think that's a much more complicated and much more individual and longer discussion. But I think most of us have some sense, not even some objective purpose of what my life is for, certainly immediate goals. Of what's something I could be doing better, or more than should be doing better, where I know I'm not really living up to who I could be and what I think I should be doing, whether it's treating a specific person better or just anything you think you should be doing. I think that's the sort of what Rosh Hashanah is about, is to ask those questions of not what have I been doing, have I done it well, but what should I be doing and how can I be doing it better. Thank you for coming.